Oh, it's
Good afternoon. I would like to welcome our noble members and guests to this session, A State of Emergency, Missing, Murdered, and Unaccounted for Women. Good afternoon. My name is Amma Jamo, and I serve as special counsel to the Brooklyn Borough President, Eric Adams, here in New York. And on his behalf, I will give you his greetings as he is a lifelong noble member. Before I became special counsel working for Eric Adams, I was a former prosecutor where I served in Brooklyn, New York for 22 years. I created the Crimes Against Children Bureau and focused on vulnerable populations within New York City, specifically in Brooklyn. Working on behalf of vulnerable populations, I must say to you that I'm so honored to be here today on such an important subject that really needs to hit the forefront of where we're going. So today's session will highlight the stark reality of documenting how women, womenx, girls of color who are victims of crime have been failed by institutions that reinforce structural violence across several nationalities, as seen in untimely reporting, underreporting, lackluster media, and unforgiven social structures that regard missing and murdered women, womenx, and girls of color as second-class citizens. Their stories and names are obscured by race, socioeconomic class, a lack of urgency gendered by racism and invisibility. A national crisis has materialized in plain sight, but remains hidden from the mainstream dialogue, causing more harm than good. Today's discussion is a call to action. It's a call to action to review systemic processes that harm and how we police our communities when women, womenx, and girls of color are reported missing. Our panelists today will take a look at how we see girls of color and their communities as a cause for their own misfortune. We will question, why can't we see girls of color as victims? What are the responsibilities of institutions when people of color are victims of crime? So today, in our short discussion, it's going to be incredibly interesting conversation. We have some very interesting and real leaders from across the nation. You're going to, on our panel today, you're going to hear from three people. The first is Chief Judy Harrison. Chief Harrison has been with the police department, New York City Police Department, since 1997. And prior to her serving in her current role as the commanding officer of Brooklyn North, she was assigned as commanding officer of the Special Victims Division here in New York City, where she made continuous ongoing reforms to focus more accurately on victims' needs. Chief Harrison, just so you know, is the fourth African-American woman in the history of the New York City Police Department to ascend to the rank of assistant chief. And she is the first woman in NYPD history to be assigned as the commanding officer of Brooklyn North. And so we also welcome her. Also, as a member of our distinguished panel is Asa Washines. Asa is from the Confederate tribes and bands of the Yakima Nation located in South Central Washington. Asa has served on the Yakima Nation Tribal Council, which is the largest tribal council in the Pacific Northwest. He was a former senior policy advisor to Speaker Damon on the 24th Navajo Nation Council. which is the largest tribe in the United States, and is currently the tribal liaison for the Washington State Attorney General's office. And just so you know, as a footnote, Washington State has 29 tribes in it. Asa has a deep understanding of tribal affairs and government and how Indian country operates, and is dedicated to the advancement and self-determination of tribal sovereignty. We welcome you, Asa, and thank you for the work that you do. And last but not least is Darcy Parton Schoon. Darcy is the owner and operator of Schoon Investigations and is a member of the International Association of Interviewers, through which she has received her forensic interview certification. She began her volunteer work with missing juveniles, which led to a career of advocacy for her clients and her work within human trafficking, domestic violence, and other sex crimes. She is also a veteran, I should say, of the United States Marine Corps, and she is a citizen of the Caddo Nation of Oklahoma. We welcome you. Thank you for everything you do, Darcy. Welcome. So now I'm going to turn this over to the panelists. And I'm going to ask them just to introduce themselves, tell us a little bit more about each of you. And we'll start today with Chief Harrison. Chief?
So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the introduction. You already spoke a little bit about me. I'll just add to it that I've been in my current role as Assistant Chief of Patrol Bar Brooklyn North for a little over a year. But prior to that, a very important role I held was as a commanding officer of the Special Victims Division. And in that capacity, my vision was always grounded in a victim-centered and a trauma-informed approach, recognizing that these crimes particularly dealt with people of color. They were underreported, and they were underreported because people feared re-victimization. They feared that they would not be believed, and they had no trust in the criminal justice system. So my work really was to take away those fears, make sure victims and survivors were informed at every stage of the investigation, to make sure they knew that although they were victims of crimes and they had no control of that they controlled the pace of these investigations, that all of the decisions, most of the decisions, were theirs to make in an effort to restore control back to them. And really just to highlight the fact that, again, these crimes are underreported, but they have to be vigorously investigated. So I wanted to make sure that my investigators had all the tools at their disposal, whether it was training, trauma-informed training, forensic interview techniques. There's a way to speak to survivors. And that was really what I focused on.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you so much. Asa, if you don't mind.
Yeah, Shach Maitsky. Just one interest to good morning, everyone. My name is Asa Washings from the Yakima Nation. It's great to be on this panel this morning. I'm in Washington State, and you guys on the East Coast. Also a veteran, United States Army, airborne. And then I've been in my role right now. This is over a year. I came on board last June with the AGO and hit the ground running. Really, there's just so many issues going on in Washington State when it comes to tribes. MMIW was the biggest one, missing murderous women / people. And so right now we're getting a task force together, a statewide task force, which includes from grassroots, urban Indian organizations, tribes, and then state agencies and whatnot. And so we really got a lot going on. We just hired an MMIW policy analyst. She just started 3 days ago, and so we have a lot going on here in Washington when it comes to MMIW, and so great to be on this panel.
Welcome. Thank you so much. And Darcy, please tell us a little bit more about you.
So I am so excited to be here. First of all, I got the list of speakers and I said to my husband, I said, I think I might be with the wrong group of people because they got a lot more clout than I do. So I don't know. It's so great to be here, and I'm super excited to talk to you guys. I started working with missing juveniles in 2011 at the behest of somebody that I knew. He was working with some missing juveniles. He'd gotten out of a career of law enforcement. He had been in 30 years. He was the sheriff for 30 years. And he just told me, he said, I didn't realize, I never realized how much we actually missed with juveniles and runaways. So he really kind of bothered me quite a bit about it. And so I started working with juveniles. I would say over the course of 5 years, I either worked or managed over 200 juvenile missing cases. And the thing about, I think people maybe doesn't always impact people, but from an investigative standpoint, if you're working MMIW, missing and murdered, like you legitimately have that full gamut of cases from missing and murdered and sex crime. They're all involved in that. If you're not willing to work on a homicide, or you're not willing to work on a sex crime, you need to step back from this field because it's not for you. And so that's kind of how I started down this particular path. I had just finished my graduate degree in educational psychology, and ironically my thesis was on disabilities and how trauma and learning disabilities impacts us. And so that kind of just ended up being a really good fit. And I finished up a forensic interview license and kind of just went from there. And at the same time, I noticed, as a tribal member, I was working with all juveniles, not just tribal members, but I noticed that within tribes, we had no missing persons policies. We had no protocols, and this is 2013. And so I started advocating to tribes locally. I started going to whatever type of council they have different forms of government. So whatever it was, I went to, whether it was elder run or council run, and I talked to them about, hey, here's what I would call best protocol responses for missing persons. And I started talking to them, trying to get them to expand them. And that was 2013. So here we are in 2021, and I finally have tribes calling me saying, hey, remember that missing persons protocol you sent us like 9 years ago? Can we have that again? So it's been a very long journey. And now if you've been watching the SCOTUS cases and you know about McGirt, I am in the state of Oklahoma. And so McGirt has hit like a whirlwind here in Oklahoma. And so we're seeing a whole different impact on MMIW cases. And that's been my life since McGirt happened. So that's kind of where I'm at right now, and without giving you too much fodder.
Darcy, thank you so much. And really, your commitment. I have to thank each and every one of you on the panel in terms of your commitment to this whole subject and moving everything forward. So clearly, we are in good company today. Now, for our first question, I will begin with the Chief, Chief Harrison. And this question is going to be for all the panelists. So, just let's listen and hear what our panelists have to say. Why are women of color targeted at a risk for such deadly outcomes? Like, why?
My opinion, it all boils down to a lack of respect towards women of color, and it speaks to how women of color are perceived. There was a report published by the Georgetown Law Center, and that report, one of the outcomes was that people perceived Black girls as fast, unmanageable, incorrigible, as compared to their white counterparts, to be more independent, to be more sexual. So what you have is a generation of Black girls who grow up to be Black women who feel that they don't matter. We've seen the criminal justice system that treats women of color as victims rather than treating them as the survivors and the victims of crime that they are. They treat them as if they're the criminals, rather. Because women of color, I believe, have been historically dehumanized, devalued. They become easier targets, and they also tend to not report as much. So you have underreporting, you have devaluing, you have a fraction of people who are not protected or respected, and I think that all leads to why that occurs.
Asa, what are your thoughts?
This exploitation, this pandemic has been going on in any country for centuries. If you think about, the romanticization of Pocahontas, right? So that was the first one that was really the first MMIW, right? And then for Yakima, it started in 1855 for Yakima. This when it comes to missing and murdered Indigenous women and people, and so there's a long history to it. And like what the chief said, it's about dehumanizing our people and seeing the value of our people, and so. And then trying to get representation matters, and so we need people, folks who are elected to recognize this, and so Indian country is severely underrepresented, and so they're the voices that kind of bring this to light. An example is Deb Haaland, Secretary Haaland. When she first came in there, one of the first things she did was create this MMIW task force within Interior, and so. Once you get more people who understand this issue, who come from our community, they can speak to these issues a lot more, and so it's been ongoing for centuries, and the mainstream community just doesn't recognize Indian country as they should, and so kind of adding to what the chief said.
Yeah. Asa, do you think, I'm just kind of curious, but like, how do you think people view Native women? Do they view them like less than? Is this why it's happening? Yeah.
Yeah, they view, they don't have an understanding of what Indian women are. This is because they don't know, and so what they see is in the media, right? Is what they see is in the books and TV, like Dances with Wolves and whatnot. And so there's this portrayal of Native women, like this romanticized book covers, and so which often gets over sexualized of our women, and so it's very hard to, our women are strong, our women are independent, they're our leaders often. They're the ones that help make the decision within a tribe. And so it's very opposite of what is being portrayed versus what our women really are.
Thank you. Darcy, what are your thoughts?
So, sorry, I had a little computer blip there. I think we have 400 plus years of colonization. And with the idea of colonization, we have slavery. And that is going to be both in the tribal community, the Hispanic community, and the Black community. So you see all, really all women of colors. We have an idea that they are a property. And what's sad is that if you track property law history, you know that women's rights and property law were deeply connected, because we didn't even have rights to own our own property. So we certainly didn't have the rights to own our own body. And so we have a history of this idea that women of color don't get to possess their free will with their body. So you have that. You have, just latent racism where they just want to control you and destroy you, because at the end of the road, victimization is about controlling and harming you intentionally. So you have those undercurrents. And then the other thing that I think is probably the most difficult for me to accept is that when you look at women of color who've been sexually assaulted versus non-women of color, you are looking at 1 in 3 versus 1 in 5. So once you've already had that first experience of sexual exploitation, whether you've been raped or groomed or whatever it is, then that second time becomes easier. And then in your community, there's this idea that, okay, 1 in 3 of us are going to be sexually assaulted. So I don't know that it's accepted, but we expect it as part of our life. And so you have all of that working, and the Urban Institute of Health, Abigail Echohawk, she did a great study. It was, she went in and her team of researchers were all Native. They interviewed all Native women, and what they found is that actually when we had Native researchers interviewing Native women, the sexual assaults went to 87% inside the group. And I would say that probably that's accurate for all women's color. And, we haven't had those studies, so it's just me speaking in general. But I would say that is a really high. I think it's really high.
Yeah.
So I think there's a long history of us being sexually exploited, and that in turn leads to exploitation of domestic violence and the things that lead to murder and the things that lead to homicide. We become expendable people in this universe.
Whoa. Wow. Everything that each of you said is so impactful. Following up, why isn't there more media coverage on Black, missing, Native, murdered women, all these unaccounted cases? Why is there a lack of media coverage? Darcy, let me start with you.
So I used to run a website with missing posting flyers, a Facebook website. And so I would always keep track of how many shares and views I would get. And so you always see, and I had some people who were Native that appeared white that would get lots of shares. And I had some people who were light-skinned Black that would get lots of shares. But I can see a huge decline as the darker their skin became and the more ethnic they happened to appear, the less shares that would get. And that was what they were, male or female. And honestly, the hardest flyer for me to get shared was a teenage Black male. That was one of the hardest ones. And so I think there's a connection between media wanting lots of coverage, and so they don't cover because people don't care, they don't share. And the more adult somebody looked and the darker they looked, the less they cared about sharing the information. I can't tell you necessarily that's why society feels that way, other than probably visit the last question we just talked about. But I think media follows suit in that they find the stories that people want to follow.
Wow. Chief, what are your thoughts?
Still think it goes back to that disrespect level. But I think, with regard to the media coverage, we have to demand it. I mean, we all watched in horror not too long ago when George Floyd was murdered. And we saw all across the United States, people organize, galvanize, they demanded police reform. Look at where we've come from that. We've demanded so many changes. We demanded justice, and we saw what happened with former Officer Chauvin. When we organize, when we galvanize, and when we demand, we get. And I think that we have to make sure that we continue to see the value in women of color, whether they be American Indian, Hispanic, Black. We have to see their value, and we have to demand that these cases be reported, but they also have to be reported accurately. So we just don't want them reported anyway. So a lot of times we see things reported and they'll say, well, the person had a history of drug abuse or the person did this. We want accurate reporting, and we need to demand that. And I think when we galvanize and get together, we can do that.
Thank you, Chief.
Yes.
Asa, thoughts?
Yeah, it goes back to the lack of resources for Indian country, and so really trying to get the word out on when a case comes up, really trying to get the word out. When it comes to MMIW, we have probably the strongest grassroots people, like organizing around cases when families are at their worst, the grassroots come around and they make it vocal. But that's not going into mainstream media. And so it's a lack of resources as probably the biggest one. And really trying to follow through with law enforcement at all levels. Trying to get the word out when it comes to tribal police departments, local sheriffs, local city, county. And so really trying to coordinate with them to make sure when someone goes missing that we have the resources to get it out there.
Yeah, without the attention, it's really hard it's almost impossible, or it's an uphill drive in order to trying to get help, right? To getting people alerted to the issue, understanding that it's actually happening. Because I think when I think about back in my days working on behalf of vulnerable populations the way I did, what I found was that a lot of times people just didn't want to believe it really happened. and it's not happening where they live. And it's amazing. It happens everywhere. And I know, Darcy, you can speak on that as well.
Yeah,
Because
absolutely. They do not want to believe it. And the moment you talk about sex crimes, domestic violence, human trafficking, people shut down because they do not want to hear that this is in their community and it's in their backyard. And sometimes I tell a story that is true and local, and people are like, wow, where did that happen? I was like, oh, just around the corner from you. And they just don't want to hear it. They want to, blindness is bliss, I guess.
I don't know, but it makes an uphill battle for a prosecutor, because I know in Brooklyn, when I was prosecuting cases, I could see it in the eyes of the jurors sometimes. They were just in disbelief. But as we know, many of our victims, this is the life they're living. And when you go missing, there's no one else talking for you except for family members. But it could be a family member. Chief, what are your thoughts?
It starts with that. I think it starts with that first officer on the scene too. That first officer that's taken that report has to believe in that situation, has to believe that survivor, has to believe that victim. That sets the pace of the investigation. So I think it starts with law enforcement as well.
Yeah, and then kind of adding to that, going off what you said, having the people that understand the system, not just the police officer. In Washington State, we have 2 tribal liaisons at the State Patrol, and their focus is helping families go through the process, helping families make sure they do the right reporting, and so they're actively busy. We got one East Side and one West Side tribal liaison at the State Patrol, and they're and they're helping make it more visible. They're making the contacts, they're reaching out. And so that's how we can make inroads with, starting with the police departments, local authorities, and making it more visible.
Yeah, and I think another issue, I love my community, right? I love them. But what they don't want to do is file a police report. They don't. And matter of fact, I did an MMIW 2 years ago, and I just said, let's, and it was one of the first ones I spoke at that was all just the population. There was no law enforcement, just people. And so I said, let's do this. Let's talk to them about how to do a police report. And I literally had to take a note card and help them walk through, like, this is the department you call. If you're in Kansas, you can't call your tribal police in Oklahoma. I mean, you can and try and file a police report, but there's nothing that's going to happen, right? And so we have to talk about jurisdiction, and we have to talk about facts, and we have to talk about avoiding questions that are ridiculous, like, that don't have anything to do with them being missing, and fill the conversation with an officer with facts. Not, don't tell them what you think or assume, just this is what happened. And I just had a case that was in Texas, and police were just like, okay, well, whatever. And so I finally just said to the family, I said, this guy is bad. Did you just tell him? They're like, no, we just told him. So I called and I said, hey, this guy that you keep that took her, he's a registered sex offender, right? Do you know that changed the narrative in about 3 seconds? And we had law enforcement officers looking for this girl in 3 seconds. I mean, and it's just really how you present information. And from when I talked to my own community about, like, we have to learn to present pertinent information, and there is a big communication gap on how we communicate in the inside of that. So I think it's important to say that.
No, thank you. And I totally am in agreement with you. And I just want to pivot a little bit, because when we talk about missing, let's not forget about our runaways, right? So how can we monitor and track our runaways who go missing, let's say, for more than 5 days? Like, because I don't believe runaways are part of this conversation. So what do we do? Asa, what are your thoughts with dealing with the runaways? Any thoughts?
Yeah, and so just taking a step back to our youth, our children, right? It's come up in the media this past cycle is about the residential schools, the boarding schools, and so we have a history of our children be taken away from us, right? And now we're shedding light on what happened during those time periods, and so it starts with these federal policies about kill the Indian and save the man, and then we go from there to the termination period. And then from there, there's all these federal policies, which, we start with ICWA, Indian Child Welfare Act, right? And then so we create this pipeline. It's almost, the system created itself to, focus on like minimizing our youth. And so it's this whole history of federal policy that just kind of goes back. And so when we talk about runaways, we tell, working with our state patrol liaisons, they tell their community, if you can file a report anytime. There's no waiting period for 24 hours. People think that's a misconception. And so it's telling the community, what they can do, what options they have when it comes to runaways. If you think they're missing, file a report. That's what our tribal liaisons tell them to do. And then so, and then from there, we start, doing what we're supposed to do and trying to like with resources and find them.
Chief, what are your thoughts from an urban perspective? When you think about New York City, are those runaways really being counted as a part of the missing?
I think runaways are actually perceived differently. I think runaways are most likely perceived as people who have voluntarily left their surroundings. So again, I agree with Mr. Washington said about making sure that we're capturing this in terms of data, taking those reports, the misconception of no, you have to wait. When you wait 24 hours, 48 hours, you're losing vital time. So you really need to get the investigative steps going. But again, it goes back, in my opinion, to how runaways are perceived. I don't think they're perceived as missing people. They're perceived as people who wanted to leave and they left. And I don't believe they're investigated the same. So my thing would be to encourage people to report, to make sure that we're providing education and awareness. There is no specific time frame that you have to wait. Report and take it from there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
So I just want to say when we're talking about runaways, right? And when we're talking about tracking runaways, I think there's two things that need to happen. I think we need policies that we interview runaways after a missing episode, first and foremost, because I keep track of all my case data, and I would say around 70% of the kids that I work with experienced something violent during a missing episode, whether they watched a robbery. I mean, I had some that saw homicides, whatever it is, but an interview after the fact. And then there's two things that I have noticed that have led to repeat runaways and repeat victimization. And one is just episodes of homelessness or unstable homes is the first. And then the second is a sex crime or mental health issue. When I've had those two things, I always just go ahead and make the plunge and start talking about exploitation and victimization. Did you experience a sex crime? I never ask a person if they were raped. I say, hey, did you have sex that made you feel uncomfortable? We don't like to call rape sex. We don't like to mix those, but a victim doesn't always know that what they experienced was rape. I mean, they can describe it to you and it's rape, but they don't know the elements of crimes like we do. So I think when we start tracking what actually happens with runaways, we're going to get a better idea of what's going on, because I've had the runaways going to the same brothel or sex crime house over and over in large cities, so.
Well, what can be done to compile these databases to track all missing, murdered, and exploited persons? Because, I mean, we need to collect the data to centralize and to begin. So what can be done? Asa, any thoughts?
Yeah, right now, in Washington State, we got 29 tribes. That's 29 different sovereigns, and each tribe's at a different capacity when it comes to law enforcement. Sometimes they contract out with local sheriffs or local police departments. And so it's first recognizing that each tribe is unique, and then trying to get MOUs within that jurisdiction, within that area, right, to start sharing data. And then, looking from local, state, federal, tribal, start looking at MOUs. There's all these national databases, but, it is just trying to get access to those databases. And it's going through like working the tribes, which takes a long time sometimes, to get a legal review from a tribe. And so understanding that lengthy process to get MOUs signed, complete, executed, it takes time. And so, but there are organizations, Fairly Tribes of Northwest Indians, it's a regional policy nonprofit that works with tribes, getting resolutions through them to support MOUs with state, local authorities. for data sharing. And so it's those type of resources that are in place now that help us in the long run. Right now in Washington, through our tribal liaisons at State Patrol, they're doing that right now. They're working the tribe to try to work through the process of getting it signed, and so we can start sharing data.
Excellent, excellent. Chief, what are your thoughts? I mean, because this information is key, and how are we going to process? So what are you thinking?
Obviously, data must be compiled across multiple systems. I think to the best extent possible, there has to be information sharing, accurate and timely reporting, but also a standardized process. I don't want a case of a missing, murdered, or exploited woman of color to be treated any differently in Washington, D.C., as opposed to Washington State. So I think there should be some standardization.
Right. And Darcy, what are your thoughts?
Well, I love the standardization comment, first of all, because we don't have a standardized comment for even identifying who we consider a runaway, we have nothing standardized across the United States. So every jurisdiction well, here in Oklahoma, they just take a stab at it. It's different every day. Even with the same department, it can be totally different as to why they thought it was a runaway or why they thought it wasn't. So I love standardization. We need to standardize how we actually look at risk levels, whether they're considered missing, endangered, runaway, whatever it is. And that's with adults too, not just with juveniles. So I do like the standardization, but the second part to that is if you're missing in a juvenile, that's difficult to keep that database. There's a lot of issues with, privacy there. So I thought that, your child welfare systems, that would be a good place to kind of start. They could keep track of it. And then, we have the police reports that we could keep track of as well. So we could have a better way to do that. I have a lot to say on this subject matter, so we don't have enough time for me to talk about it. But if you would like to email me, I'd be happy to send you back information on what I've talked about as far as standardizing and keeping things. And part of that is having tribal missing persons policies. So that way they have a report protocol that they can keep. And not only can they share that information, grants, right? We want grants. So I think it's important to do those things.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you think the 24-hour waiting period, like it's been such a myth nationally? I mean, how can we change that? Or should it be changed? I mean, what are your thoughts,
Yeah. That law was actually recalled in 1992 in USC 72, I believe, is when that was actually recalled. So I'd love to move past 1992, but it's just constant. I have to educate people on that constantly. I had a police department leave 2 12-year-olds with a sex offender for 48 hours because they weren't going to file a police report before that. So it's just constant. You just have to, you can't shut up. You cannot shut up in this profession. That's what you can't be quiet. That's it.
Chief, what do you think from an urban perspective, what you're seeing in New York City?
In terms of runaways? Can you just repeat the question?
Yeah, no problem. My question was basically, let's see, here we go. It's regarding the 24-hour waiting period. Is that something we should change? What are your thoughts when it comes to?
I can't tell you how many times I've spoken to people that were looking to make reports and thought they had to wait 24 hours. We've got to get that message out. That's education and outreach. That's informing people that there is no time to wait. I think when you wait, I know I've said it before, we miss certain steps, and it puts us behind investigatively in terms of what we can do. So I think it's very important to let people know that there is no wait. In New York, we don't wait. We don't wait. If you believe someone is missing, you don't have to wait 24 hours. We need all the information that we need, especially if you believe that they're a victim of a crime. We need every piece of information that you have, anything that is going to help us bring that person back and connect them back with their family and solve a potential crime.
I think there needs to be probably something that we tell all the communities, because I think people really do believe what they're seeing on TV and what has actually been a part of the law in certain jurisdictions. Asa, any thoughts about this? like in terms of the 24 hours and what we can do?
Yeah, we just started our task force. It's going to be a 21-member statewide task force, which includes state agencies. And one of the things we need to educate them on is this myth that you're talking about. And so not only community members need to understand it, but agencies need to understand it. And then trying to get advocates that are community advocates can continue to do outreach to the to family members. And so it's an all around effort, just trying to educate people. And so once, and so hopefully through this task force, that's one of the things that, we can really start helping with.
That's great. I saw a question, and I think it's I want to just slide this in, even though we'll have a part where we're getting questions and answers from the participants. But there's a question about young ladies in homes, right? And as they're prime targets for trafficking and other victimization. So Darcy, I'm going to throw this out to you because of the fact that you do a lot of investigating. You're out there in the field. But what do we do? What are your thoughts about young ladies in these group homes? Are they prime targets? I mean, it seems like they are, but what have you found?
They are, but not necessarily because they're in a group home, right?
Okay.
They do have infiltration of a group home, but when you have a history of, here's the things that make you vulnerable for trafficking, right? Homelessness, drug abuse, previous victimization, drug addiction, drug use. So, when you look at who's in a group home, they're already vulnerable and desperate. So you have exploitation there. And just being in a group home allows them to understand, hey, this person is exploitable because they are desperate in some way. So those person could be anywhere, just the group home identifies. So maybe we protect better who's in the group home and their privacy.
Mhm. Anyone else want to chime
I,
in?
I agree. I mean, I agree with what Darcy said. I mean, this is a vulnerable population already. And I think it's just very vital and important that the group home is not just a roof over their head, but it's also a place where we're connecting them to vital resources.
Great, excellent. Well, let me ask you this, just in general. How do we get the bystanders, the institutions, the storekeepers, the everyday person who witnessed violence against women of color to stand up, to come forward? Whether you're in Brooklyn, New York, or you're on a reservation, anywhere throughout this United States, like, what do we do? How do you get other people to react safely? Chief, thoughts about that?
Yeah, I have some thoughts about that because a lot of the work I do in Brooklyn, and me, I go anywhere I'm asked to go. I speak with everyone, but my message is pretty consistent about shared responsibility. And when you say, how do you get buy-in from store owners, or how do you get buy-in from members of the community? We have to really make them know that they're stakeholders, key stakeholders, and that this is a shared responsibility. Public safety, protecting women, protecting children, protecting citizens is a shared responsibility. That it's not just the responsibility of the police or the prosecutors. It's a shared responsibility with key community stakeholders, clergy, everyone coming together. So I think, when we continue to push that message out, we see buy-in because they see themselves as part of the process, that this is something that we're doing with them, not something that's being done to them.
Excellent. Asa, what are your thoughts, especially with the tribes?
Yeah, not only community buy-in, but reaching out to them and to provide them training. One thing that we're talking about in Washington State, when it comes to our community, is casinos. Casinos are high trafficking areas. And so we're trying to be creative on how can we work with tribal casinos and maybe their security or their gaming agents to identify what are some of those key things that they can look for when they're like on the actual gaming floor. And so what training can we provide them? And so reaching out to them, telling them that it's okay to do this, but then creating a process for them to report. And so so there, and we're still trying to identify more ways, like what are these choke points that we can like come together at, like where, and let's identify them and create a training for it. Let's create a process for it. And so that's what we're trying to do right now.
And in the same breath, though, when we look at it, and I was just reminded, I'm looking at one of the notes in the chat, is that, most violence against women occurs by someone they know. So even though they may be in the casino in certain places, we do know that a lot is going on, if you will, behind closed doors. Any more thoughts as to that? Because how do you get people out?
And for tribal communities, really, our tribal members need to be reminded about who they are and where they come from, because when violence against women, women from our community, it's not who we are. It's not what we're about. And so, coming from that traditional cultural standpoint, they shouldn't be doing that, and they sometimes need to be reminded. Sometimes often we get lost in the fast world, we get lost in our daily lives. And so I think that's a part of it. Our community members need to be grounded in traditional values and who they come from and who they are. And so that's why it makes it more easy for them to come forward and help, like, look, do reporting. That's not who we are. Violence against women is not acceptable. We've never done that to ourselves. And so, so there's a cultural aspect to it that they should be aware of.
Darcy, any thoughts?
Yeah, so I would just want to remind people, or not even remind, just people may not know, exploitation is predatory, right? So it is the design of somebody who preys on women to exploit them, to have an intimate relationship with them, because that's how they exploit them. So yes, we know our abusers all the time because they have preyed upon that particular person. So I think it's I want to say, yes, we do know them, but also that this person is here intentionally and they're predatory. And I never want to lose in any conversation that we're ultimately here because of predatory behavior. And we should acknowledge those predators and why they're in somebody's life.
All right. Wow. Impactful once again. Moving on, is there a national database that the public can access to get an advocate to assist with reporting missing persons when they don't trust the police? Because remember, there's, we talk about communication, there's an ongoing trust factor, trust between the community and law enforcement. And then I'm sure it grows, whether it's within the tribal government, state government, federal government. Everyday folks really don't trust, or a lot of people don't trust. They don't know what to do. So what can be done? Is there a national database?
So there is. So with NamUs, first of all, with NamUs, you can start a report with NamUs, which is the National Identification for Missing People, basically. And that's not the exact phrase, but I'm forgetting what it is now. But if you call them and start a report with them, they'll say yes, and then they'll call police, and then police will call and verify with you. So it works a little bit differently. You can get all the information out. I know that Michael Nance, who's our NamUs regional coordinator here, will do this 100 times a day for people if he had time. So I do know that NamUs loves to get the information out. So if you can get just the missing persons report started and then go to NamUs. But I think 2015 was the first time I did a seminar on why we need missing persons advocates in tribal communities and within the victim witness advocacy programs, because people with missing family members have a very different, because number one, being missing isn't illegal, and so it's treated differently, right? And so you just need a different type of advocate.
Like when it comes to the indigenous population, though, I mean, I think statistically they're saying, and I've read somewhere, that 60% of the population are residing outside of the reservation, are urban Indians. Like I'm one of them. How do we capture those numbers? Like, where do those numbers fall? And how do we know? And how, what I mean? Because I'm just thinking, like in Brooklyn, New York, are we capturing those numbers of indigenous, women of color and crime victims in this arena? Chief, what are your thoughts? Are we?
No, I did see something that briefly popped up in the chat, and I think that sometimes we are not capturing accurately. I think sometimes they're being misreported as, Hispanic, misreported as African American. I think sometimes it's misreporting. So I think there's a lot of education and a lot of outreach. But I just actually wanted to comment on something that Darcy said with regard to the advocates. We see here in New York, we've got domestic violence advocates in precincts. We've got sexual assault advocates in precincts, but we don't have the missing persons advocates. And sometimes those situations are unique. So that's actually something to consider. So I just wanted to mention that.
Great, thank you, thank you. I'd like to pivot to the Not Invisible Act of 2019. In that its goal is to improve how government agencies identify Indigenous crimes and report them accurately. What are the federal, what are the tribal, federal, and state and local agencies, what are they going to do to ensure that? Because if we're not able to collect the data like we're talking about, we're trying to identify and bring people to the table, how do we ensure compliance? Or is that too early in the conversation? What should we do? Asa?
Well, we need to ensure, starting from when the from the first call is taken from a family to the local authority, when how that report is taken and followed through, we need to ensure that the report of Indigenous person is identified, and so that needs to be taught through training back to the local authorities and how they operate the reporting procedures. Oftentimes, they're underreported because they're not reported, or they're misidentified. Like Chief said, they're the Black or Hispanic, but they're not reported as Indigenous. And so, working with our state patrol and her, when she works with the families, for some reason it gets reported as non-native, and so we don't know where that disconnect is, because the family went reported as native, the tribal liaison is there, help reported as native, but then we get the report, it's not native. And so, like, what's going on? Where's it cut off at? And so just ensuring the local authorities know how to report it. That's the biggest issue right there, like, the first point of contact.
I've been told several times by law enforcement when I'm filing reports that they'll put me down as Caucasian, and I'll say I'm not Caucasian, I'm Native. And they say, well, that's not an option in our software. So there's actually a lot of software for police reporting that leaves off that as an option, because I've been told that repeatedly from different agencies. And I think there's some narrative there that needs to happen.
What are your thoughts? What do we do? Chief?
I mean, again, we talk a lot about timely report taking, but it also includes accurate report taking. So certainly, we've heard some instances where we've got some work to do. So I think, collectively, I think it involves, having discussions like this, having forums like this. I'm trying to watch the chat, and I see a lot of comments that is saying that these conversations are long overdue. There's definitely some room for improvement. And I think informational sessions such as this, and certainly there's some improvement at the law enforcement level that should be done as well.
Absolutely. It's interesting. I was just looking at something, and it's saying that research indicates that cases involving African American women or African Americans remain open 4 times longer than cases involving Caucasians. Does that ring true to all of you? Do you think, based on your experience, Deirdre? I mean, not Deirdre, I'm sorry, Darcy, I'm so sorry.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. 1,000%. I have 2 homicides right now that I feel like if it had a different victim, that we would be, because we like good victims here in Oklahoma. We like for you to look good and be good. So if you're not a good victim, we're not going anywhere with it. So I absolutely think that's an issue.
What about you, Chief?
I know one of the things that I did when I was in special victims, I didn't want cases to be closed fast. I wanted cases to be closed when they needed to be closed. So I wanted the investigation to be accurate. I wanted the investigation to be thorough, and I wanted the case to be closed either when we made the arrest or when all leads were exhausted, but when I was actually satisfied that all leads were exhausted. So as far as having cases that are open for too long, I think that there is no time frame. As long as we're actively investigating and actively putting the work into the case and going through all of our leads, exploring all of our leads, and making sure we can bring that case to a successful resolution.
Asa, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, and on this, I mean, when we talk about MMIW, P, there's a first M and then there's a second M. And the first M has its own, once you start going into it, it kind of fans out into its own, the first M. And then there's another silo for the second M, and it fans out and webs out into all these things. And so, it's trying to identify those, I guess, processes when it comes to, like, is this a missing person or is it a murdered person? And then from there, tracking those homicides in Indian country. When something happens like that in Indian country, the FBI gets involved, and the FBI doesn't want to share their data, and so they want to keep it to themselves. And so trying to get that data, trying to figure out what's going on, and then another aspect to it is cold cases. Oftentimes these cases, they just get cold, and any country for the most time has to maybe they'll fund it themselves. They'll hire like a retired investigator and look up these cold cases and try to bring closure to the families. And so there is no length of how fast the case should be closed, like the chief said. I think it needs to be thorough, but then at the same time it goes back to resources. Families don't got money to put up billboards. Families don't got money to put on the ads on the news, and so it's very difficult for families that don't have resources. And so but someone famous goes missing, like they're all over the news, and so I'm not trying to say one's more important than the other, but like who has the resources. And so
absolutely. And you see that, like, even now I see it like in social media. I see it a little bit more with the indigenous population, let's say Facebook, but by and large, when certain populations go missing, they have the money and the resources. So I guess it goes back to, how do we educate the community, right? Because it's on a couple of fronts. That if, don't worry about the 24 hours, something's not right, it could be a family member, but we have real concerns. So what do we tell our communities? Like, where can they go? Who can they, because sometimes telling people to call the police is just not a reality. And then it's which police? They might be tribal police, the, city, state, federal, at least in Brooklyn, they're going to call NYPD. So what do we do? I leave that open to everybody. Because remember, Elizabeth Smart, and what happened to her was horrific, right? But we know she's not the only one, the only victim who suffered like this. But her family was able, because of the finances and because of just the doors, they were able, okay? So how can someone who is known by no one outside of their community, how do we get that to happen?
So I'm just going to jump out there, because I'm in several grassroots organizations that help anywhere between 3 and 15 families a week, right? And I have got them, I don't want to say because they work their tails off, but they asked me, here's protocol. The faster you can get their flyer out, the faster you can do recovery, right? But we don't necessarily need billboards. We need to know where they last are. And so I think there's a great need to trade not just community members and family members. And this goes back to advocacy, right? Having a missing person advocate is my opinion that the most valuable resource for law enforcement a lot of times is the family, or grassroots that are going to go out and get that flyer out. So if you have 100 people or 10 people showing up to help you, if all of them can bring 20 flyers and you go to the area they last were and you get that flyer out, it really minimizes cost on people. It gets that information out really quickly. It gets leads coming in very quickly. And it is one of the best protocol responses is just to go to the last place they were seen and get a flyer out. And I'm talking about a hand printed flyer. They're 50 cents, you know, at most places. They're between 35 and 50 cents. Is one of the things I do. That is one of the things I count as a business expense. I just print off so many a month and I give them to these organizations because, you know, if they have lack of resources, but if community members knew like, hey, when your family member goes missing, if you could do this immediately, you would see these cases resolve so quickly. And that's why we need advocacy. That's why we need a missing person advocate, because families are sitting around going crazy thinking, hey, what happened to my loved one? They can use all that energy to get flyers out for you, you know?
Yeah, and then really creating that network, starting with the grassroots, and then having a statewide liaison. I'm like Washington State, we are trying to really push it. We got 2 State Patrol tribal liaisons that work on cases actively every single day, right? And then creating, putting resources to creating liaisons in different capacities at the local level, county level, at the state level. Oftentimes, I work with our liaison and they need help in other states. And so trying to connect them with the AG's office in California, in Nevada, in Arizona, New Mexico, like, look, you know, we need help trying to locate this person. We try to go through our resources. Can you help us? And so I'd reach out to the AG's office in other states, trying to get information about some person that's maybe in Clark County. And so not only having grassroots, but really trying to institutionalize these liaison positions, because it does go far. Someone who understands the system, who can help advocate at that higher level from the inside goes a long way.
Okay. Well, I've just got a note and I need to pivot. Thank you so much, everyone on this panel. I really do appreciate it. And I know the people who are listening appreciate it as well. But we're going to hear from our audience. And I know I've asked 1 or 2 questions in the course of our conversation. So let me just look at Noble here is monitoring the chat and they're sending a question. So let me just take a look. Okay, here's one question. Would roll call training be helpful in educating street level officers on this subject matter?
Definitely.
Chief, yeah.
Definitely. Hearing that message before they go out to patrol, very important, but not only at roll call, also during in-service training. And I can speak for the NYPD and dare I speak for other agencies also, but training is ongoing. We always have training. There's always in-service training, retraining. So definitely training at roll calls, but ongoing training, not just for the people that are going out and doing patrol. I think for the whole force.
But Chief, like roll call, like in based on TV, because that's what people kind of gather their subjects, if you will. Roll call happens pretty quickly. So how can you do training? Like, what would you do? Like, give me an example. Like,
So I like the fact that you mentioned TV, because roll call here in the NYPD is similar to that, but it's not the same. So obviously at roll call, you're getting your assignment, you know what area you're going to be covering, you know when your meal is going to be, you know what RMP number you're going to be driving, and you know any pertinent things that you may be asked to address during your tour. But there's also roll call training. And a roll call training is where, and it's not a long time. Sometimes it's 15, 20 minutes, but it's getting a message out. Sometimes it's a speaker that comes in that speaks about a particular subject and trains everyone. And everyone gets roll call training, not just the day tour, not just the 4 to 12, but the midnight units do also.
Asa, any thoughts about if this were going to happen like within the tribal police or other members of law enforcement?
Well, this is just taking a step back, like not when they get to their precinct or wherever, but when they get their initial training, their certification, I think, training, tribal police oftentimes go down to New Mexico to get the federal training down there. And state patrol has their own state certification process. And so identifying those training when they first come on, like what to look for, how to identify it, cultural training, oftentimes, state patrol, do they know that what's it like to work with a tribe? And so there's a cultural component that's really lacking in some areas, that does need to be institutionalized when they first come on board.
Darcy?
So I was in law enforcement in the Marine Corps. So just before I spout off, I didn't want you to think that I'm just not don't want to be talking about something I don't know anything about. So to be fair, so I think roll call training is important. And I'm gonna the same person ask another question about having victims talk to law enforcement.
Yes.
So I actually wrote some training for law enforcement to kind of help interview victims. It's called historic trauma and the forensic interview process. So we're talking about, all of communities of colors basically have historic trauma in them, right? So when we're talking about this, if the victim is capable of, and so I did a lot of research, and my master's degree is educational psychology. So I did a lot of research. If the victim can identify how law enforcement can apply their information to their job, it will become a successful training. So the important part is not just the training, but how does this actually apply? What are you going to do with this, right? So I think anything that you do, make sure that it's applicable, and you don't just have people who are in there talking about their trauma, because as much as we appreciate their trauma stories, to do that. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing, it would be that I think you maybe a missing flyer every day at roll call, like, oh, this person is missing, and just choose one or choose two. I think that would actually be helpful if we included those two things.
Now, another question. I mean, several states consider running away illegal under 18. Do you think this is a tool that works? I got to go back to you, Darcy, because you talked so much about the runaway population.
Okay. So, I have found that what it does is just create more paperwork and less response. I mean, I can't say like 100% because I'm not in those states, but you can hold police accountable. Maybe it's a device to hold police accountable, but our resources are stretched in law enforcement. I don't have to tell people. I mean, maybe I do have to tell people that, but we don't have a cop for every missing person, which is really what you need. The missing person cases can take hours and hours of research. And so, no, I think the best proactive way is to teach people how to respond, how to get flyers out there, how to get missing persons information to the community in which they're lasting. I think that's the most impactful thing you can do.
Chief Harrison, what are your thoughts? Because there's certain
I heard you say in some states that they count runaways as illegal. And my problem with that is, again, you have to get to the root cause of why people are running away. Mm-hmm. And also, I'm always looking to connect people to resources. And I think sometimes, people who are doing certain things maybe are in need, skills, services, education, maybe mental health services. Maybe there's some challenges there. So I wouldn't want to treat this as a criminal act. I'd want to treat this as a problem or a symptom, if you will, and let's get to the root causes of that problem.
Excellent. I'm looking for other questions here in the chat. And I think we've touched it, but maybe you can just give us a summary line, each of you. Should there be education with community members that helps in all of these efforts? And if each of you could just do like a one-liner, so to speak, because I think we've been covering this along this discussion. Asa, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, just really, once you start creating your network, know what resources are in the community. maybe often tribes are under resourced, and so there's maybe a nonprofit. And so really, you know, going back to grassroots nonprofits, what are the resources available in your community?
Mhm. Okay. Darcy?
Absolutely fan of community training.
Okay, no doubt about it. And Chief Harrison?
Again, you win when you work with the community. So anytime we're working with the community, educating the community and tapping into them, using them as a resource, I think that's a win-win situation.
Excellent. So let me just take a look at the time. It's 2:39, so we still have a few more minutes here. And but I want to give you guys, because I know, Darcy, we spoke earlier, and I know that there was a lot for you to want to cover in this. And I gave you my word that if we were able to, I was gonna, allow that, because this is such an important topic. So first and foremost, I just really want to thank everyone for just doing the work that you're doing and participating in this much needed conversation. But I'm going to ask each of you, as we begin to work towards wrapping up, and if I see other questions, I will chime in and I'll ask you guys that from the chat. I'll begin with you, Darcy. And look at this as your summary, your summation at the very end. What is the real takeaways that you really want all of us? And remember, you have a wide audience, not just in Indian country, but all over the United States. But this issue still remains the same. And, when I think about it, I think about that it's always underreported. It's always under-examined. It's always under research, and it's always under prosecuted, and there's an invisibility that exists for women, womex, and girls of color, and members of the LGBTQ plus community. So our vulnerability basket, if you will, is quite big. There's so many people who fall into that. And so conversations like this are key, but any golden nuggets you want us to walk away with as we continue this journey, please, and I'll begin with you, Darcy.
Okay, so I think it's really important to standardize how we assess risk in missing persons. I think we need better assessment models, because the social sciences that we have, the research we have, and the NIJ, the National Institute of Justice, has a women's consortium that they have $300 million worth of free research. It's there for you. It's there for prosecutors, for law enforcement. It tells you all, what to include in your risk assessments. It tells you what to, at every level, prosecutor, law enforcement. It's fantastic. So I think we need to do a better job of taking the social sciences we have and mixing that into our risk assessments. And then we need better protocols within more than just, this isn't, I don't think missing person is something we can just toss off on law enforcement and say, fix this, right? It is a daunting task to find a missing person if you haven't learned how to apply your resources, and you haven't learned how to get your resources, and it's available to us at lower levels if we can just learn how to do that. And I think that what has made anything that I've done in the missing world successful isn't what I do, it's levying those resources of people who care about their community. So if I could just standardize and protocol, like, we need so much more knowledge out there, because if you will spend 15 minutes just telling your family, hey, go get these flyers out for me, I promise you'll get information back so quickly. It's very successful model, and it's a very successful program. So if I have two things to say, that's the two.
Thank you so
I have
much.
100 things to say, but we'll stretch to two.
But that's great, because you know what? We're going to have to do a part 2 one of these days. Chief, I see a couple questions in the chat. Does the NYPD Special Victims Unit include missing persons investigations?
Yes and no. So in the NYPD, we have the Special Victims Division, but we also have a missing persons unit, and those units are separate. But when necessary, those units will work hand in hand with each other. If there is an allegation of a sex crime, then special victims will have the lead on it and will work with all other partners, all other specialty units regarding that investigation, but will have the lead on it.
Okay. And also, this is for everyone, what type of outreach is being done in high schools and with people living at-risk lifestyles? Asa, I'm going to throw that to you. In the high schools.
From my understanding right now, not a whole lot's being done. I mean, it's one of those areas that we just don't talk about in high schools. And so it goes back to family members, it goes back to community organization, grassroots, talking about it within their own circles, but there's no, and see that's one of the things that I think this task force, if you're creative enough with the task force, there's areas that you can focus on. There's victim and survivor resources, which is one focus area. Training is another area, and then policy and legislation. And so that could be a recommendation is to teach this at the local high schools, and you need that. You need legislation in the state to do that. And so, like those three focus areas, you can be creative as we want to be with these task force, statewide task force, and that could be one of them. Making sure our high school students know, what are the risk factors, what are the signs, for youth.
Yeah, and I actually think, we might even begin before high school, right? Laying down the nuggets in elementary school, junior high school, all the way up through high school, because we know at any age a child can be a victim. Chief Harrison, what about, any education being done in the high schools in New York City?
So when I had the Special Victims Division, I had a team. I had an education and awareness team. That unit was a citywide unit. So we had jurisdiction in all 5 of the boroughs. And we went throughout all 5 of the boroughs to different schools, after school programs. And we spoke to youth, not just at-risk youth. We spoke to all of the children. We spoke to them about things about good touch, bad touch. We brought in partners from other Detective Bureau units, such as gang. We know that there's a certain segment of population that is vulnerable for gangs and wanting to belong, and peer pressure and social media. So as part of those outreach efforts, that is what I did in Special Victims. Now we have a newly created position, if you will, YCO in the New York City Police Department. It stands for Youth Coordination Officer. And we're dealing with youth, and again, not just at-risk youth, because we're trying to get to the good youth as well. We want them to have positive contacts with the police. We want them to know that the police are their friends. We want them to see us not as the bad people, but it speaks to also building trust, building relationships, and staying in contact with them. So we're in schools and we're speaking to them. We do outreach. We do basketball camps, after school programs, and things of that nature.
I'm seeing something in the chat, and it will go to you also, Chief. It says New York City is using social media heavily to share information about missing people. And according to the Missing Persons Clearinghouse in New York, they have been able to resolve within one or 2 days, which is kudos, right? We're happy to see that. Have you seen any uptick in that tool, and how successful is it?
Absolutely. Everyone, and I shouldn't say everyone, but there are so many people that are on social media now. So we use social media to get out wanted flyers. We use social media to get out information regarding a plethora of things, including people that are missing and people that are, that need to be found. So we've used that as a tool. We've been very successful at that, getting that information out there. We're on all different platforms. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, dare I say we're on TikTok? I don't think we should be, but we are, but we're out there. And especially young people, that you see young people all the time with their heads in their phones, right? So that's a great way to get information out, as opposed to the old traditional ways. We definitely use social media to our advantage, and we've been very successful at it.
Darcy, what have you found in the use of social
Absolutely.
media?
Absolutely, it's so successful in as much. And so I'll just give you an example. So I told you I have a difficulty getting flyers shared when when I can't get, um when the darker somebody becomes, the harder it gets. So I had a case. This girl was very, very dark. She's Hispanic. They were not here legally, not that I care, but it was a perception in the community that I had an issue with. So I started going to all her friends' houses, and I say, "Give me your phone," not illegally, and I take a flyer and I tag her and all her friends in it, and I go to the next house and I did it, and we had her back in about 18 hours. It was fast, very fast. It's super fast, and it got 100,000 shares. By the way, it's the most shares I've ever gotten on one person.
Wow.
Yeah.
Asa, is that something that's going to be used? Are you seeing that, especially amongst the tribes?
Yeah, especially with the grassroots. The
Uh-huh.
grassroots, they mobilize really quick
Mhm.
when it comes and sharing information, and our youth, um, they're heavily connected. Like everyone's saying, there is some issues though when it comes to connectivity and having access to networks. There's some places on reservations where there is no
Yeah.
signal. There's places along the Columbia River where there is no signal, and so trying to be mindful of those as well. And that's when the hard flyers come out. That's when like going door to door works. And so in the absence of social media, old school organizing works.
Makes good sense. Just being cognizant of the time, it's 2:50. What I would like to do, we heard from Darcy and her golden nuggets. And so I'd like Asa, if you don't mind, because I just don't want to run out of time. I want to make sure that all three of you are able to impart us with some good golden nuggets to take.
Yeah, I really look forward to the statewide task force that they have in Washington State. We, through working with tribes, working with our state reps, this task force I look forward to those recommendations when it comes to victim survivor resources, training, and legislation. There was a comment earlier about, why pursue legislation when they're trying to, push us out. We need to change that narrative. The more visible we are, the more visible we can bring our issues to light, the better we'll keep moving forward. And so we're on this statewide track working the tribes. I look forward to Deb Holland, Secretary Holland, and her MMIW task force. What that's going to encompass. And so it's really trying to align all the resources. We got NCAI, National Congress of American Indians. They have an MMIWP task force. Fairleigh Tribes Northwest Indians, we work together. We've got 37 tribes in the Northwest coming together: Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Western Montana, Southeast Alaska, Northern California. And so it's coming together. And so it's really we're turning the page and having those resources finally available to us. When I first came on board, I reached out to the Oregon, California, their tribal liaisons at their AG office and see what's going on with them and how we can work better together. And so, the plug, I guess, is, I think we're finally going to turn the corner on this just because we have the people there to do the work now. And so if your state doesn't have a liaison at the state patrol, ask for it. If your AGO doesn't have a tribal liaison, ask for it. And it helps and it goes a long way.
Yeah, absolutely. Chief Harrison, golden nuggets as we walk away.
I think at the onset of my conversation, I spoke about the lack of respect towards women of color. And I think that's the first thing that has to change. The second thing that has to change is that until we change how we respect people and protect people, they won't be encouraged to report. And that leads to further trauma and further victimization. So we need to encourage people to report. Data needs to be standardized across all agencies, certainly education and outreach. And one of the good takeaways for me, I heard, was just about the advocates, the missing persons advocates. And that's probably a suggestion that I'm going to give to my police commissioner, because I think, like I said, we have advocates, domestic violence advocates, we have sexual assault advocates, I definitely see the need for missing persons advocates too. So I want to thank you for leading this panel. I'm happy that I was a part of this esteemed panel. And I want to thank everyone who shared their comments, their thoughts, their questions in the chat. And thank you.
Thank you so much. I know we still have a little bit more time, so I'm just going to scroll through to see if there is like a question or two. But Chief Harrison, your remarks were, just as Asa's and as Darcy's, are so on point. It seems as if standardization is key. We've started in the first step. I know each of you are working continuously on this, but it's about the conversations, about opening this subject matter up, talking about it, knowing that this occurs and it impacts us. And the question becomes, what do we do, not just locally, but nationally? Because as I said earlier, it's a real community issue. It's a local issue that has impact on us nationally, because every one of us are a potential victim, and there are victims everywhere. And so how do we educate? Legislation needs to be passed. And it's so funny because even with that, it calls for a great deal of organization and identifying those individuals who are willing to put the time in, like each of you have done so in your respective careers and the people that you work with. I just want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart. When you work on behalf of the vulnerable, which each of you know what I'm talking about when I say that, they look to you. They look to you for answers, whether they're the victims or the family members or community members. And they worry because sometimes, a child walks out the door, and whether you're 14, you're 4, you're 46, you could be 64, you're somebody's child. And when you walk out the door and you're missing or unaccounted for, and people don't know, and the people closest to you feel like people don't care. We can't have that, not in our local communities and not with our communities in our relationship with law enforcement. So I really do thank you, because I've seen it on both ends. I've seen it as, as a tribal member myself, a member of the Nypd and Oyate, and also as a member of law enforcement, being a prosecutor here in New York City for 23 years. Our women and our children and our vulnerable people are just that. They remain vulnerable until good people like you, professionals, sit at the table and start sharing ideas and start coming up with the solutions. So I thank you. I thank you very much for the work that you do. And please continue to do it, because without you, there's a whole lot of people who get no justice in this. And I've always believed that justice delayed will never be justice denied. So, Darcy, you got to keep doing what you're doing, and you got to keep educating. And you have so much to say about all of this. And you have to get on a national circuit, because you know what? We need to learn. Chief Harrison's picked up from New York City, big time. She's picked up nuggets that she's going to be able to move forward within, the police department here. Asa, with all your knowledge with dealing with the tribes, we have to bring the tribes in as a part of the national conversation. It's important. Indian women and the vulnerable, no matter if they're Indian, Black, Latino, Asian, no matter what, it's something that we all fight for. So I thank you. It's 2:57. I guess I have to respectfully turn the mic over to Deirdre, but I thank each and every one of you. Thank you for those who chimed in and listened and watched our Zoom presentation. And until we meet again, peace, and just be careful and be safe. Be safe, be safe. Thank you so much. Thank you.